Meghan Markle, a less than royal narcissist, Part 30. Regular viewers of this series understand that the purpose of this vehicle is to enable people to understand how the narcissistic dynamic unfolds, to demonstrate the behaviors of the narcissist, the various indicators of the narcissism, different types of manipulations, the response of the narcissist to certain situations, to enable you to not only gain understanding as to how this saga is playing out, but also to enable people to see applicability to their own situation. There are so many different facets to it that it provides a very useful and ongoing vehicle for affording this understanding. One of the incidents which has arisen appertained to, of course, the dress fitting and the allegation that Meghan Markle made Kate Middleton cry. A particular incident which took place with regard to the various fittings for Meghan's wedding dress and the flower girls bears scrutiny. An individual called Yankee Wally has written on Tumblr an account appertaining to information provided by this person's cousin. Now, I will say at the outset, that is the case with any information that is provided, the analysis is done on the basis of the information being provided as accurate. In certain instances, this may not be the case, and therefore that would alter, of course, the method of scrutiny. For the purposes of analysis only, it is assumed that what has been portrayed is accurate. That isn't me saying that it is, but merely operating an assumption to enable the analysis to be undertaken. There is no doubt, of course, from the vast array of information that has come my way, both private and public, with regard to Meghan Markle, to confirm her narcissism. That is not in doubt. But there will be instances where information is provided, which, of course, like any information, is based upon a perception of the individual providing it. And therefore, it bears keeping in mind that an open mind should be adopted with regard to the veracity of information. However, for the purposes of scrutiny, for the purpose of enabling people to understand, I'm proceeding on the basis that this information is accurate, rather than wasting time going into the veracity of it or otherwise, and therefore applying the analysis to these behaviours. It's important that people understand that. I will read from the piece that has been provided by Yankee Wally, and then overlay the analysis on it to enable you to gain further understanding of this particular incident. Yankee Wally writes, I have a cousin who works as within Givenchy, and one of her best friends from work was at the fittings for Meghan's wedding dress and the flower girls. My cousin had just went on maternity leave, but basically what Meghan is saying is nothing but lies and nonsense, as she was a complete diva and treated the seamstresses at Givenchy staff horribly so, and was nasty to Claire, who was there most of the time alongside my cousin's colleagues and best friend. What we have here is an assertion that the version of events that Meghan Markle has put forward, that she was the one who was made to cry, is a lie. Of course, remember that when an incident arises in the mind of the narcissist at point A, it is necessary to assert control, and therefore the narcissism, with regard to lesser and mid-range narcissists, will cause the narcissist at point A to recall an event that occurred in the past at point B through the narcissistic perspective, so that their recollection, their perspective is different. That doesn't mean that that will always happen, For instance, if the recollection can remain intact as it was, then it will serve the narcissist purpose. So, for example, let us say that the narcissist is arguing with his victim, and as part of the argument, she is threatening his control, and therefore he has to assert control over her by being argumentative and insulting her. And so, as is a common thing, narcissists using absolutes such as always and never, the narcissist says to her, "You never listen to me, you're always arguing with me." And the victim, not lying down, says, "What do you mean I'm always arguing with you? Since when?" That, of course, is challenge fuel. The narcissist's control over this victim is challenged, and therefore the narcissist, and let's say this is a mid-range narcissist and therefore is unaware, has to instinctively respond to nullify that threat to control. And therefore what the narcissism does is that it selects something from the past. Now, in the preceding week, there was another argument between the narcissist and the victim, and that occurred. And therefore the narcissist can say, well, last Wednesday, there was an almighty row just about the fact that I was playing golf. That event actually happened, and the narcissism recalls that event from last week, using it now to nullify the threat to control by supporting the narcissist's position that this individual is always arguing. On another occasion, the narcissist might allude to past arguments, even though they have never happened. But that doesn't matter, because in that moment, as the narcissist asserts control, the narcissist believes, because of the way that the narcissism operates, that these arguments had taken place. So when he says, "You're always arguing," basically the narcissism is telling him, this person is always arguing. And if she asks for specific instances, he may well respond with, "Oh, I don't need to go into detail, but it's always happening. There was an argument last week and the week before that and the weekend before that." Notice that the answers are relatively vague and amorphous, and it's the deflection. Should she try to pin him down onto specifics, he'll either lie or, more likely, deflect further or withdraw. Because there were no arguments, and the narcissism isn't evolved enough to allow him to give specificity, and instead just references, "You were always arguing, there have been arguments in the past, there was one last week, there was one 2 weeks before that," just vague references to them, rather than going into specific details, time, date, and what was actually said. A more evolved narcissist would be able to do that, would be able to lie far more convincingly. But the point remains that in certain instances, an argument which did take place will be brought up and used against you. You think that it's been buried and that it's past? No. We will always dig up the past where it suits us. And either we will dig up an incident where you were clearly in the wrong, usually because you've lost your temper as a consequence of the way that you've been treated by the narcissist, and that will be used against you. Or we will use an event which occurred, but from the narcissistic perspective, there is an alternative slant put upon it. So, for example, you were arguing a week ago with good reason, but the narcissist won't see it that way, and will twist events instinctively, where an unaware narcissist, to enable that narcissist to portray that you are the problem. Or, in certain instances, the narcissism just invents events. And that's where a more amorphous response is provided from the less evolved narcissists. The reference to, "Oh, you're always arguing, and you argued last week and the week before that and the weekend before that." So when Meghan Markle needed to assert that she was the one who was made to cry, in that instance her narcissism was telling her that that was actually the case and that she believed that lie. Of course, here there is evidence proffered that that was indeed a lie, where the individual writes that Meghan is saying is nothing but lies and nonsense. References to her behaving as a complete diva. Of course, that is a value judgment that's being placed on the behaviour by the observer, but it is not uncommon, of course, for narcissists to behave like divas. Classic one springs to mind, Mariah Carey, with outrageous demands on the rider for concerts, etc., huge entourages, everything in the dressing room needing to be white, particular actors not addressing anybody who wears red, others requiring that only certain coloured M&Ms are placed in a bowl, and so forth. And therefore diva behaviour is found within narcissists. It's evidence of grandiosity, evidence of a sense of entitlement, and a failure to operate with emotional empathy. The report states that Markle apparently treated the seamstresses at Givenchy staff horribly. Again, haughtiness, lack of emotional empathy, need to assert control. The article continues, stating, Meghan made Catherine cry. Assertion of control, lack of emotional empathy, knowing that she was pregnant, and this was because she was incredibly nasty to Charlotte. Again, if this is correct, being nasty to a child shows a sense of entitlement, the need to assert control, a lack of emotional empathy. Meghan was adamant on not having Charlotte or George in the wedding party, assertion of control, but Charles and the Queen made her do so, as they are Harry's niece and nephew. Accordingly, since Prince Charles and the Queen put their foot down about ensuring that Charlotte and George were in the wedding party, this would of course threaten Meghan Markle's control, and therefore she would have to nullify that threat. She could not remove them from the wedding party, but her narcissism therefore dictated that she would in effect take it out on Kate Middleton, the Duchess of Cambridge, and in so doing would assert control against her as a means of dealing with the threat to her control posed by the decision to force her to have Charlotte and George in the wedding party. The article continues by stating, Meghan didn't pay for the dress either, as Charles paid for it. Freeloading, sense of entitlement. And she was forever changing her mind on what style and design she wanted for the dress and veil. Classic bridezilla behaviour. Of course, one would state that it is the wedding day, and a bride would want everything to be perfect, naturally, and one is perfectly entitled to change one's mind with regard to the style and the design. However, repeated changes evidence the following. The fluid nature of the narcissist with the necessity of asserting control. Irrespective of what the dress actually looks like, it's about the control, not the look. A lack of emotional empathy for those who are working with her, repeatedly making her change it. A lack of accountability to get on with matters. This also brings to mind a situation where Steve Jobs, another narcissist, was asked to his opinion with regard to a picture of a shark for a presentation before an event involving Apple. And in this instance, he would state that the design shown to him was not right, and then another one, and he would say it's not right. And he would go through different choices until eventually he would say yes to one, which was, of course, a shark that he'd been shown 8 sharks earlier, which he had dismissed, and all of a sudden it now became acceptable. It isn't about the inherent acceptability of it, it was all about Jobs asserting control in that moment over the relevant sidekick or designer dealing with that instant. Grandiosity to keep changing mind, assertion of control. And similarly here, an individual who would keep changing her mind with regard to the style and design wanted of the dress and veil over and over and over again. It isn't about what the design is actually showing. It's about the necessity of asserting control in that moment over the designers and using the dress as an excuse. And therefore, because the interface between Meghan Markle and the relevant designer was through the dress, she would triangulate that individual with the dress to assert control over them because of the need to assert control on a moment-by-moment basis. Accordingly, she would say, no, that's not quite right, I want to alter it. And of course, it's highly likely that she altered it back to a design that she'd had before, which she'd discounted and then says, yes, that's acceptable, only to change her mind again. The reason being, a situation is fluid, and therefore the need to assert control, being constant, results in this repeated behaviour of triangulation. The article continues by explaining that because Meghan Markle was forever changing her mind on what style and design she wanted for the dress and veil, this is why it was such a badly fitted dress and veil, because it was basically a last-minute piece put together, as she wouldn't stop changing her mind. All the staff were at their wits' end because of Meghan. She would have them working on strict rules and long hours, sense of entitlement, assertion of control, lack of emotional empathy, but then would shout at them, manipulation, although a rather rudimentary one, assertion of control, lack of emotional empathy, saying that their work was awful, insult, crude manipulation to assert control, that she didn't want it like that, and forcing them to start all over again. Assertion of control, lack of emotional empathy. She slapped one of the staff, physical violence, assertion of control, lack of emotional empathy, who was trying to do the fitting for one of the first design ideas that Meghan wanted, when they did nothing wrong. All the staff have said that Meghan definitely seemed to enjoy treating them like servants, grandiosity, assertion of control, the response to the provision of fuel, and constantly belittling them. Belittlement is a form of manipulation, lack of emotional empathy, whilst on their backs about it all. Most were nervous wrecks, and I'm glad my cousin was off away from it all. The Givenchy staff gave her nicknames such as the Dictator Duchess-to-be, Meddlesome Meghan, and Miss Snobby. Clearly, she wasn't endearing herself to the Givenchy staff. My cousin's colleagues say they're certain that how Claire allowed Meghan to constantly treat them, the Givenchy staff, but also the end result not reflecting the high standards of Givenchy either, is a major factor in why Claire was let go suddenly. But Claire is apparently quite like Meghan, in that they are arrogant and pushy. But concerning Charlotte, Meghan hated having to include her as a bridesmaid. This shows a lack of emotional empathy for the child. It also demonstrates the need to assert control and the response to the threat to her control posed by the diktat that Charlotte be included as a bridesmaid. The article continues by saying that Meghan made it quite frighteningly clear and constantly mocked and made fun of her. Mocking, form of manipulation, mocking a child, lack of emotional empathy. And made fun of her, especially when she would arrive from home or school, like any other child, a bit messy from having fun, called her chubby and mocked her voice. Again, on the basis that this actually occurred, behaving in such a manner towards a child demonstrates the need to assert control and a complete absence of emotional empathy. Remember, the narcissist's need for control is over everybody. What is also interesting here, though, is that the facade was dropped. This is because this was going on in private, away from the glare of the flashbulbs, the cameras, the world stage. And it's common with a narcissist that away from the wider world, that the dark side is demonstrated. More typically, it tends to be the case that the narcissist only reserves the behaviour, which is sustained devaluation, for the intimate partner primary source and occasionally an intimate partner secondary source, and maybe one or two non-intimate secondary sources, the odd friend, the odd family member who might be a scapegoat. And everybody else, we're dealing with a mid-range narcissist, particularly mid and middle-range type A or B, or upper mid-range, and certainly greater or ultra, gets to see the supposedly nice side of this individual. The fact that the facade was being dropped here, in such circumstances, is useful. Remember, this isn't a conscious decision by Meghan Markle to think, oh, I'm not bothering portraying myself in a nice light here. What was actually happening was that there was a direct clash between the facade and the need to assert control. Ordinarily, with a mid-range or greater narcissist, certain manipulations are generally off limits because of the facade light flashing, basically saying you can't do these things because they will affect the facade. So, by way of example, take a male narcissist at a dinner party. His wife wounds him. He could slap her. That would assert control over her. But all of the other guests would be horrified at this mid-range narcissist behaviour, and therefore the narcissism hasn't done its job. Why? Although he's asserted control over his wife, he has failed to assert control over everybody else at the dinner party, and thus in solving one problem, he's created 11 others. And the narcissism has to assert control over everybody. Hence, it would choose a manipulation which would preserve the facade, whilst asserting control over his wife. So he would lean in and whisper something nasty in her ear to bring her to heel, whilst preserving the facade and smiling at everybody else. However, where the need for control is such, the facade will fracture. Where the two butt up against one another, the facade will eventually come second best. And interestingly, this appears to be an example of where the facade would fall to one side because of the need to assert control, and interestingly, appertaining to a child. And it's clear that the diktat given by Prince Charles and the Queen that Charlotte had to be a bridesmaid caused considerable threat to Meghan Markle's control, so that the facade fell to one side with regard to her treatment of both her and her mother, Kate. Charlotte said to Meghan about how she'd be her new auntie, like how she had her auntie Pippa. And then Meghan went off about saying she was much better than Pippa Middleton, who it had been announced privately was pregnant. Again, a declaration of stating that you're much better than an individual is an assertion of control, because the comparison to somebody else threatens the narcissist's control, and there has to be the one-upmanship, which is a form of the narcissistic dynamic. Catherine found out from Maria, who witnessed it, and both ladies, including William, were furious, as Charlotte had been reduced to tears, but then Meghan would mock her for crying. Belittlement, mockery, forms of manipulation to assert control, absence of emotional empathy. Ivy Mulroney isn't a nice little girl whatsoever, and was constantly rude to the women working on her dress fittings when she arrived. And Meghan definitely showed a lot of favouritism, triangulation, towards Ivy over Charlotte, and pitted them against one another, triangulation and a common manipulation by narcissists, saying that Ivy was going to be the best flower girl, flattery, assertion of control, and that Charlotte should learn how a proper girl behaves, which, in effect, scapegoating. So in that little triangle, we have Ivy, the golden child, being praised and flattered, and thus controlled that way through compliments and flattery, whilst Charlotte is, by comparison, treated badly. And the golden child held up as, this is the example that you should adhere to. Remember, talking to a very young child, absenting emotional empathy. The article continues stating that Meghan Markle basically encouraged Ivy to bully Charlotte, which she did. Again, assertion of control, in effect by proxy, triangulation, and a lack of emotional empathy. The article continues stating Charlotte ended up getting pulled out of the fittings due to how Meghan and also Jess and Ivy were mocking and bullying her, which is the reason why Charlotte's dress didn't fit to her proper measurements, as the seamstresses had to use Florence Van Custen for the fitting of Charlotte's dress. Meghan had been rude to Catherine, insult, assertion of control, sense of entitlement, absence of emotional empathy, and had been rude to Charlotte and Maria for pretty much the whole thing. And a strong rumour is that this is one of the reasons that the Fab Four summit was so tense. Of course, that's speculation, but it would make sense that if there had been this going on in the background with regard to the unpleasant treatment of children, then this would result in there being a tense atmosphere when Harry, William, Meghan and Kate got together. The article continues. The shoes were a big issue for the British-born flower girls and their parents, as they were really uncomfortable for them. But Meghan refused to let them wear tights or even socks, lack of emotional empathy, sense of entitlement, and said to the Givenchy and Aquazzura staff that this was what happens when you coddle children: dismissiveness, lack of emotional empathy. They turn into horrible whiny brats, insult, that want everything when it is her wedding. Grandiosity, self-absorption, assertion of control, lack of emotional empathy. The flower crown head wreaths were also last minute, and literally had Charlotte told it before she got in the car that here was hers, which is when it was quickly fitted best as possible. Lack of accountability, lack of emotional empathy. Ivy was singled out again by Meghan as a special one, favouritism, golden child, and called the mini-maid of honour, flattery, which is why she didn't have a flower crown head wreath or her own bouquet, as Meghan had made it clear to all the other girls, even Remy and Rhiannon, children of her college friend, that they weren't as good as Ivy. Again, if this occurred, then belittlement of children, evidencing a need to assert control over non-intimate secondary sources, alongside a lack of emotional empathy. Finally, the article states, the florist was so last minute getting chased up that it is a reason for why the flower colour scheme didn't fit with the wedding and flower girl dress colours. Claire tried to get Meghan to try a more muted white fitting for a divorcee and an understated veil, but Meghan just screamed at her about unnecessary negative opinions. And my cousin's best friend that was there at the time witnessed this. Again, on the basis of screaming, the suggestion is a threat to control. The sense of entitlement, the lack of emotional empathy, and the need to assert control results in the rather rudimentary response of screaming. So there we have an account from this individual which, if accurate, provides a useful amount of material which can then be broken down for the purposes of analysis as I have done so, within that snapshot to show the interaction between a narcissist and people attending to the provision of the dress and fittings, and children, all of them being non-intimate secondary sources within the fuel matrix, all of whom came upon Meghan Markle's radar and had to be controlled. But rather than control all of them with flattery, compliments, and benign manipulations, save for the favoured child, Ivy, everybody else appears to have been subjected to bullying, intimidatory, nasty behaviours, malign forms of manipulation, snippy comments, insult, mocking, belittlement, malign triangulation. And as such, this recollection provides a very interesting snapshot for the purposes of further analysis to gain understanding of what has been happening. Please share this material, like it, subscribe to ensure that you continue to access my unrivaled information about narcissism. There are plenty of other videos appertaining to Meghan Markle, if you've not accessed them all, and even more videos which will shine more insight into the world of narcissism about a wide variety of subjects, which includes other famous people who've been analysed, and also an unrivaled level of information about narcissism, narcissists, and the narcissistic dynamic. You can go and fill your boots, as we say. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.